This is the story of Air Transport International, Flight 782. On the 16th of February, 1995, an Air International DC-8 was to fly from Kansas City International Airport to Toledo in Ohio. Before the plane even got off the ground, the pilots were having a bit of trouble at Kansas City International. The cargo DC-8 was fueled and filled with cargo, but the pilots couldn't get engine number 1 to start. A quick diagnosis revealed that the gearbox drive of engine number 1 had failed, and that there was no way of fixing that problem at Kansas. With that, the flight to Toledo was canceled. There was no way that this plane could make the trip in this state. But the problem was complex enough that they could not fix the problem right then and there. So, the decision was taken to ferry the plane to Westover Metropolitan Airport in Massachusetts. With one DC-8 out of commission, the company flew in a replacement from Dover, Delaware. The flight crew from Dover would be the ones ferrying the plane back to Westover. They'd have their work cut out for them. They'd take off, they'd fly, and land this DC-8, all without one operational engine. Now, you might be surprised to find out that broken planes are flown around all the time. For example, I once made a video about Emirates Flight 407. The plane had sustained some serious damage in Australia, and it was flown to France to be fixed at low altitude. When flights like these are undertaken, it is done so very carefully, after considering all aspects of that flight. That was the case here. By 5:39 p.m., the replacement DC-8 had arrived, and so had the pilots. The captain decided to take on about 30,000 pounds of fuel as ballast, and they prepped for taking off with just 3 engines. By 8:04 p.m., 3 of the 4 engines were operational, with the leftmost engine being the one out of commission. As the crew taxied to runway 01 left, they let the tower know that they only had 3 engines. The crew was very concerned about the winds and made preparations for takeoff. They really wanted to use runway 19 right, but that one was out of the picture because there was inbound traffic on that runway. In the cockpit, they went over the 3-engine departure procedure one more time. The plan was to line up on the runway and then set engines 2 and 3 to max power. Those are the 2 inboard engines. Then, as the plane accelerated, they'd bring up engine 4 slowly. By the VMCG, or the minimum control speed on ground, they'd have engine number 4 at max power as well. Well, that was the plan, and if done correctly, they would have this bird in the air in no time. By 8:19 p.m., the DC-8 was at runway 01 left. They started the takeoff run, but the crew sensed something wrong, and they decided to reject the takeoff. The controller inquired if they needed any assistance, but they didn't. They just wanted to line up and try again. As it turned out, they had max power on engine number 4 way too soon, at about 100 knots instead of 107 knots. The pilots discussed what had happened. They were slowly bringing in engine number 4 when the power suddenly jumped from 1.6 EPR to 1.9 EPR. That jump really caught them off guard. That power increase made controlling the plane a bit difficult. 6 minutes later, the plane was back on runway 01 left. They were ready for attempt number 2. The pilots got their takeoff clearance, and the DC-8 was rolling down the runway. This time, as the DC-8 picked up speed, the plane began to turn to the left again, which was followed up by a correction to the right. The plane was still turning to the left. The first officer said, "We're off the runway," and then the plane lifted off. Once in the air, the DC-8 struggled to gain altitude. It did not stay airborne for long though. The DC-8 then banked to the left, and it impacted the ground in a 90-degree left bank. The smoldering wreck of the plane just lay there near the airport's runway, and it was obvious that none of the 3 people on board survived. The plane had clearly gone off the runway. The investigators wanted to know if something was wrong with the plane itself that made it hard for the pilots to control it. They checked the flaps, the rudders, the rudder trim setting. This plane was configured correctly, and this plane was airworthy. It should not have crashed. The investigators got their next clue from the runway itself. The tire marks were very telling. The marks showed that the plane was being pushed off the runway by the thrust asymmetry caused by the disabled engine. You see, since engine number 1 was out of commission, at full power the plane had more thrust on its right side when compared to the left. This would cause the plane to veer to the left on the ground. This is why the VMCG, or the minimum control speed on ground, was so important for this takeoff. When you've hit the VMCG speed, you can control the plane without one engine on the ground using the aerodynamic control surfaces. That meant that if you brought an engine number 4, the outboard engine on the right, to the max power after VMCG speed, then you'd be able to counter that thrust asymmetry using the rudder. But if you were to bring in engine number 4 up to max power before you hit the VMCG speed, then the rudder would be overwhelmed and your plane would go off the runway. The tire marks showed exactly that. On both takeoff attempts, the pilots brought engine number 4 up to max power well before they hit the VMCG speed. Thus, they were not able to deal with the thrust asymmetry. Looking at tire marks is one thing. They needed hard proof. They analyzed the sound of the engines from the cockpit voice recorder, and it was just as they had suspected. The pilots had brought in engine number 4 way too early, which gave them an uncontrollable plane. To understand why they did the things that they did, the investigators looked into the history of the pilots. The captain, they found, had some issues with flight proficiency, and he wasn't authoritative enough in the cockpit. For example, in one of his previous jobs, the airline declined to promote him to a captain, and then ATI decided to put the captain on domestic trips so that he could gain more experience. They also found that this captain had been in 3 other 3-engine takeoffs, but this was the first one where he was the captain in command. The first officer was considerably less experienced than the captain. Most of his experience was on smaller planes. As it turned out, ATI put a relatively inexperienced crew on this flight to minimize delays. Usually, airlines only allow the most experienced crews to conduct these 3-engine takeoffs. In fact, the captain had called the chief pilot and they discussed about possible crosswinds at their destination. Had they just discussed the takeoff, then maybe the chief pilot would have been able to help the captain understand 3-engine takeoffs better. But there's a few more layers to the story. When the investigators looked at the charts recovered from the wreck, they noticed that something was off. The VMCG that was written down on the chart was 107 knots. But based off of the calculations done by the investigators, this should have been 116 knots. That meant that even if they had waited till they hit their computed VMCG speed of 107 knots, they would have brought in engine number 4 way too early. They would not have been able to control the plane because the rudder would have been overwhelmed and would not have enough control authority. So why was the wrong value calculated? As they went through the charts, they realized that the flight engineer calculated the VMCG value using the temperature in Fahrenheit instead of centigrade. Most of the calculations at ATI were done using Fahrenheit, except for the VMCG calculation. This meant that the calculated VMCG value was 9 knots less than the correct value. Also, in your opinion, what's a better system for aviation, metric or imperial? The final clue came when they went through the cockpit voice recorder. They were having a bit of trouble with the 3-engine takeoff procedure. The procedure said, and I quote, "As soon as possible, smoothly accelerate the engine opposite the inoperative engine to max power during acceleration to VMCG." End quote. The "as soon as possible" part probably threw the pilots off. They probably took it to mean that engine number 4 should be accelerated quite early. But as we now know, that is not desirable. In later revisions, they changed that line to say smoothly advance power to clear up any misconceptions. In addition to that, the pilots experimented on the 3-engine takeoff procedure for their second attempt. Since the captain was the one flying, the procedure said that the captain should be the one to add power on engine number 4, but on the first takeoff attempt, the captain added power too early, causing the rejected takeoff. So, for attempt number 2, the flight engineer volunteered to do it. When the investigators tried this in the simulator, they found it to be awkward and disconcerting. Since the captain wasn't the one applying the thrust, he was reacting to an unknown amount of thrust. It was as if he had lost one of his senses. Then, right before takeoff, they had this conversation. The flight engineer asked, "How much rudder were you sticking in?" The captain replied with, "I had it all the way in." That should have alerted the crew to the fact that they were in trouble. I mean, if you cannot control your plane at VMCG using 100% of the rudder's control authority, then it meant that something was seriously wrong. This should have sparked some discussion in the cockpit, but it did not. All this points to the fact that the training provided to the pilots on 3-engine takeoffs by ATI was inadequate because they demonstrated a lack of knowledge. One final thing that might have played a part in this crash was fatigue. The pilots had just completed a round trip to Europe before they were to fly Flight 782 back. Yeah, the captain was only supposed to make domestic flights, but sometimes he flew internationally as well. They crossed 6 time zones in a short span of time, and they flew at night. Their circadian rhythms were messed up. In addition to that, the captain's rest time was repeatedly intruded on by the company. The flight from Dover to Europe was 9 hours long, so as per regulations, the crew could not fly for another 16 hours because they would be fatigued. But they were asked to fly this ferry flight just 12 hours after checking into the hotel. The captain most probably got about 4.5 hours of sleep. But yet, this was legal. There was a loophole. The whole 16-hour rest period only applied to revenue flights. This was not a revenue flight. This was a ferry flight, and ferry flights are governed by Federal Aviation Regulation Part 91. As per Part 91, this was completely okay. The sad thing is that on takeoff, the slightest thing can turn catastrophic. A forgotten checklist item, a tiny handle in the wrong position, the wind's coming in from the wrong direction. It really doesn't take much on takeoff. But if you want to see how little it takes to bring down an airplane, I highly suggest that you watch my video on Pan Am Flight 799. Links on your screen right now. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.